The Embroidered Sunset by Joan Aiken, Chapter 6. Dear Uncle Wilby, I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear that I've found Great Aunt Fennel Culpepper alive and well. She has moved away from Appleby, as she didn't like to stay on alone in her cottage after a friend of Miss Howe died, and she has been living in a boarding house in Kirby-on-Sea. It is a perfectly dreadful place, run by an old drunk called Mrs. Tilney. You never saw such a dark-cluttered hole in your life. How they don't all break their necks every day, goodness knows. Well, one of them almost did the other day. I gather I'm going to get Great Aunt F out of there as soon as I possibly can. By good luck, somebody, a Mrs. Marsham, has recently opened what seems to be a very decent private old people's home in Appleby itself, and I think I can get the old girl in there. It would be much more suitable than she'd like to be back in her home village, if properly cared for. I'll let you know developments. But a postal strike starts here next week, so you probably won't be hearing from me for a while, and it won't be any use your writing to me, as your letters wouldn't get through. Please give my best to Aunt Rose and Coral. Yours, Lucy. Lucy grinned her foxy grin as she stuck down the flap of the air letter, thinking of all the huge gaps she had left in it. The main gap, of course, being that she still had no proof whatsoever that Aunt Fennel was in fact Aunt Fennel and not Aunt Fennel's best friend. But she was not going to say that to Uncle Wilby, nor was she going to confess that the old lady was still far from placing her full confidence in Lucy, was still in a very strange state, indeed, of alternating fright and affection, mixed terror, defiance, and little impulses of trust. It was like dealing with a badly disturbed child who had a high IQ and no education at all. Another subject Lucy had not touched on was the pictures. After all, she thought, as long as Aunt Fennel's alive, Uncle Wilby has no claim on them. I'm damned if I'll help him get his paws on them. And if my old girl is really Miss Howe, the chances are Aunt Fennel would have left the pictures to her, so he has no claim to them. I wonder if Aunt Fennel has ever made a will. Wonder if old Sourface in the Bank of York would say. The third topic Lucy had not mentioned was the one she had only skirted around, even in her own mind. Why was Aunt Fennel, call her that till there's reason to do otherwise, just why was Aunt Fennel in such a paralysis of fear? For there was no doubt that fear had caused her to leave her beloved home and move away from Appleby. Fear had kept her on the move from one shabby boarding house to another. Fear made her conceal her address and confuse her identity. And who was the person alluded to as that other one whom she suspected of having killed her friend? Why did she plainly have every expectation that whoever it was would follow up the first crime by trying to murder Aunt Fennel herself? Was this just an old lady's dottiness, the paranoia of old age, or did she really have cause to fear? Who would want to kill an old lady, a harmless old girl in a village at the back of beyond? But then, an old lady had been killed. Let's not make mountains out of molehills, Lucy thought. Old age is accident-prone, like it or not. Old ladies do sometimes tumble into streams and die of exposure. It's probably all just a load of baseless nonsense. Yes, and what about the village gossip? The wailing ghost in the glen calling for vengeance. Nuts to village gossip. When people live cut off by 40 miles of barren upland in a singularly unfrolicsome village, their only diversion is inventing ghosts and jumping out on each other. Where was Lenny Thorpe on Friday night? Nuts to Lenny Thorpe, too. Anyway, the village superstitions and Aunt Fennel's fears were all subjective, whereas her peril at Mrs. Tilney's was real. It had been perhaps 7:30 in the evening when they had arrived at the address in Reservoir Street, which Aunt Fennel had at last, with considerable reluctance, divulged. Honestly, Aunt Fennel, you can't walk home. You're much too tired and upset, and all the streets in this town are just about vertical. Reservoir Street turned out to be only 2 blocks away from Redcar Street. I might have come across you any time these last few days, Lucy said. Oh, no, dear, because I never go out. I had to today, you see, to cash the check. I'd have found you sooner or later, said Lucy. Mrs. Tilney's number 19 was a 2-story terrace house. Its tiny front garden was almost entirely filled with junk, old coal scuttles, marble-topped washstands, curtain poles, and defunct standard lamps. An agile person could just scramble through. Lucy wondered how they managed about deliveries. Perhaps nothing was ever delivered here. "We'll have to ring," Aunt Fennel said. "Doesn't she give you latch keys?" "Oh, no, dear." Lucy began to wonder if the bell worked, but at last the door flew open and a small, print-overalled, white-headed woman stood blearing regardingly at them. "Oh, it's you," she said at last, recognizing Aunt Fennel. "Where the heck have you been? You'll get no supper now, you know. It's all over and done with long ago. Well, come on in." "Are you Mrs. Tilney?" Lucy said. The small woman's eyes swiveled around to take in Lucy. She had a pronounced cast so that her eyes looked disconcertingly different directions. Lucy addressed herself to the right one. "Yes, I'm Mrs. Tilney. Who the devil are you?" "My name's Culpepper. I'm Miss Culpepper's great niece," Lucy said dispassionately, observing the felt slipper's headscarf over curlers and sour sweet waft of gin. A bleary civility replaced Mrs. Tilney's aggression. "Oh, pleased to meet you, love. Do you want to come in and have a cup of tea? Have a sit in the kitchen, I'm afraid. All the old dears are watching telly in the lounge. There's no room in there." No room anywhere, Lucy thought, edging her way incredulously through the 4-foot square of lobby crammed with bicycle, grandfather clock, umbrella stand, and 12 coats, getting a glimpse of the tiny front room filled to capacity with a huge TV set and what looked like a number of corpses sitting elbow to elbow. "I guess my aunt ought to go straight to bed. She's very tired. Do you think I could heat her up? Some milk?" "Oh, certainly, love, if we've got any milk, that is. If not, I'll just pop around and borrow a cupful from Mrs. Holbrook." The kitchen smelt of stale grease and contained 4 chairs, each occupied by a fat, scruffy animal. "I love dogs and cats," said Mrs. Tilney, surreptitiously helping herself to a teacup full of Booth's Dry. "They say it's a sign of a soft heart, don't they?" "Oh, yes." Lucy found an egg and broke it into a pan full of blue milk. "That's right, love. Make yourself at home. You'll find a cup somewhere." Mrs. Tilney swayingly made her way to a chair, tipped off the occupant, and sat down. "I get so tired evenings looking after the old dears all day." Her eyes closed. Lucy washed a cup, found a hot water bottle, filled it from the boiling kettle, and made her way upstairs. She managed not to trip on the trailing vacuum cleaner lead, dodged round the statue of Venus. Who in God's name had ever brought that into the house? And wardrobe blocking most of the upper hallway, and prospected on toward a dim light. She found Aunt Fennel struggling to undress by the glimmer of a candle in a small room containing 3 beds, 3 commodes, another wardrobe, and a large chest of drawers. "Here you are, Aunt Fen. I've brought you a posset. Let me give you a hand. That's the way. Oh, you want your corsets under your pillow?" Yes, dear, always." "Okay, now hop into bed quick and drink this while it's hot. There's a bottle for your feet." "Oh, dearie." Aunt Fennel took the cup in trembling hands and sipped. A tear slid down her cheek. "Nobody's looked after me like this since Dill died." "Well, they're going to from now on," Lucy said grimly, looking at the hank of toweling which dangled from a nail in the wall 2 feet away from the flickering candle. "How you haven't all been burnt in your beds, I can't imagine. And as for that old gin pot downstairs—" "Oh, Mrs. Tilney isn't too bad," Aunt Fennel protested in an anxious whisper. "I've been in far worse places than this, dearie. She has a kind heart, you know." "Kind or not," said Lucy, "I'm giving her a week's notice tomorrow." No, there wasn't the slightest doubt that Great Aunt Fennel would be far better cared for in Appleby Old Hall, hideous it might be, and Mrs. Marsham was not Lucy's personal cup of tea, but it was clear that she was an efficient organizer and the place was clean and decently run. Lucy grabbed her hold-all and ran down the stairs of her own boarding house. "I shan't have time for breakfast this morning," she announced gladly, putting her head round the dining room door and getting a great greasy waft of bacon. "I want to get to the doctor's surgery at 9. "Bottle of Knapp Street, last house to right. Something the matter, love?" "No, it's not me. Thanks, it's my aunt." One of Aunt Fennel's random impulses of confidence had caused her to disclose to Lucy that she often suffered from toothache, which her herbal remedies, strangely enough, did little to alleviate. Lucy was determined that before they left Kirby, she would find a reliable dentist and have the poor lady's teeth set to rights, even if this meant dragging her bodily to the dentist's chair. Drunken Mrs. Tilney had, of course, forgotten the name of any dentist, but thought her doctor had a list of them up in his surgery. The last house at the bottom of Knapp Street had the well-worn look that doctors' houses acquire. Following a sign that said surgery, Lucy went down a side path to the back. Passing a window, she automatically glanced through and saw a sitting room furnished with a bizarre but pleasant mixture of skeletal modern furniture and opulent oriental drapes. On the walls hung at least 8 of Aunt Fennel's pictures, more probably, Lucy thought, pressing her nose against the glass in a vain effort to see round the corner. Somewhere, not far off, she could hear a piano being played, rather well, and a male voice singing. She went on to the waiting room. Nobody else was there, but the door had rung a bell. As Lucy looked round her for a list of dentists, Dr. Adnan came briskly in. Today he was wearing a lemon brocade waistcoat over a flowered needle-cord shirt. "Are you the only patient?" he began, and then recognized Lucy. "We meet again. How delightful. I hope you have some disease I can cure." "I think it's highly improbable," said Lucy coldly. "Oh, too bad. You are too young to have already an incurable ailment." "Look here," said Lucy. Why did you tell me such a pack of lies the other day? What about your Hippocratic oath?" "My dear young lady, I told you not a single lie, and the Hippocratic oath has nothing to do with such a case. It does not mention lies. You said you had never heard of my great-aunt Fennel Culpepper, and you with one of her pictures in the boot of your car at that very moment, not to mention 8 more in your parlor. 10, if we are precise. A very industrious lady, your great-aunt. Would you like to see the others?" He led the way through the office into the sitting room, which turned out to be L-shaped. On the wall that Lucy had been unable to see were 2 more of Aunt Fennel's pictures. Below them stood a modern upright piano with some manuscript music on it. "So why did you tell me that you didn't know Aunt Fennel?" "Ah," he checked her with an upraised hand. "Let us be accurate. I said she was not my patient. Perfectly true. Naturally, I had heard of her." "Why? Why naturally?" "Why, my girl, because as soon as I went to Apley and saw some of those miraculous pictures hanging in people's houses, I made it my business to find out who had done them. An old lady, I am told, who had recently moved away to Kirby. They seemed surprised that I find the pictures remarkable. Just old Mrs. Culpepper's hobby, I am told." "So why didn't you tell me this the other day?" demanded Lucy. "I'm her great-niece, after all." Dr. Adnan looked at her inscrutably, with eyes as dark as mussel plums. "You took long enough to come and look for her," he said at last. "How am I to know whether your intentions are good or bad?" "Why in heaven's name would they be bad?" "How should I know? All I know is that someone within the last year has given this old lady a bad scare, and that she prefers to hide herself in Kirby, where perhaps her loving relations cannot find her. I am certainly not going to be the one to give away her whereabouts." "So you did know where she was?" "I have not said so." "Well, you needn't have any further scruples," said Lucy tartly, "because I know that she's at Mrs. Tilney's in Reservoir Street. I suppose you've seen her there?" "Not as a patient. I visit 1 or 2 of the other old people in the house. She does not approve of doctors, you know, but she tolerates me because I like her pictures." "So I notice." "But you have hardly looked at them yet. Aren't they beautiful?" he said in his enthusiasm. He took her arm and piloted her round the room. "Which do you think is best? Sometimes I incline to Daniel in the Lion's Den, but that vision of St. John the Divine is really a masterpiece. It needs bigger wall, really, and that is the best I can do at present. Look at the detail. It is better than Bruegel." He switched on some lights, muttering, "Light in this country is hopeless. Hopeless. But when I take them back to Turkey, aha!" "Aha," said Lucy frostily. "Charming. So you leave the poor old girl to live in that den of squalor where you collect her pictures and take them back to Turkey. What do you think she would say?" Dr. Adnan considered, frowning. A red velvet cap with a tassel lay on the piano. Absently he picked it up and slid it to a comfortable position on his head. "Do you know, I think she would not give a damn," he said. "My impression is that once she has finished a picture, she does not care any more about it than if it were a dish of mashed potatoes. She has certainly given them away freely enough. And as for that den of squalor, she herself chose to live there. Who am I to chase her about? You Anglo-Saxons are sadly predictable. Benevolence with you always takes the form of organizing people in ways which they probably do not enjoy at all." "But that place is dangerous. Some old boy nearly broke his neck on the stairs the other day." "So, the street is dangerous, but you would not prevent her going out, in spite of the fact that she might get knocked down by a car. By the way, they never did discover who knocked over that poor Clow." "Listen," said Lucy. There was a table behind her. Absently she sat on it, pushing aside her hair. She asked Adnan earnestly, "Do you think she really is Great-Aunt Fennel? Do you think she really did those pictures? She doesn't seem to be doing any at the moment." "Well, the circumstances are hardly conducive, are they? Also, I understand her eyesight has deteriorated in the last year. Besides, if she is not herself, who is she? You talk in paradoxes." "She might be her friend, the one who fell into the stream. I mean, it might have been Great-Aunt Fennel who fell in." "What would be the point of the impersonation?" said the doctor slowly, sitting down on the piano stool. "Well, my uncle's firm pays an annuity to Aunt Fennel. At her death it should stop." He studied her thoughtfully. Lucy felt herself going pink. "This was my uncle's idea," she said defiantly. "So he sent you to investigate?" "Well, what if he did? It's his firm who are paying out the cash." Lucy felt she had slipped into a false position and returned to her original question. "The thing is, she seems so childish most of the time." "You think the person who did those pictures was not childish? But they are primitives, after all." "Yes," Lucy agreed. "But when a person has created works of art on that scale, you'd think her character would give some indication of it."
"And you consider Miss Culpepper's does not? Do you already know her so well?"
"I spent the last few days with her, getting to know her."
"But perhaps she is cleverer than you. Perhaps she is pretending not to be Great-Aunt Fennel."
Lucy stared at him. "Why should she do that?"
"My dear Miss—"
"What is your first name?"
"Lucy," she said mechanically. "Thank you. In Turkey we prefer to use first names. Lucy. Aha! Very appropriate. Miss Lucy Snow." As usual, he seemed to be enjoying some private joke at her expense. "How can I tell what your aunt's reasons might be for pretending not to be your aunt? You Anglo-Saxons are so often a great mystery."
"Just now you said we were sadly predictable."
"In the mass, yes. As individuals, no. Now with Turks it is just the other way around. You can tell what an individual Turk will do, but the nation, never."
He spun round on the stool and suddenly sang, accompanying himself on the piano.
"Dial me on my linguaphone, I am cut off, I am all alone. Get your computer to call up mine. The number's new M, new F, 909. Oh, it will be a day for jubilation when nation can really speak to nation."
"Don't you think that is very good?" said Lucy.
"The tune is not bad. The words don't impress me."
But in fact, she was quite impressed by his voice, a pleasant tenor, and by his nimble playing. Dr. Adnan grinned at her.
Now shall I give you a cup of coffee to seduce you?"
"Now shall I give you a cup of coffee or seduce you?" "You'll do neither," Lucy said coldly. "I came to get the name of a dentist for my aunt, who seems never to have been to one in her life."
"So we can't establish her identity by her bridge work."
"Well, Fawcett is about the best in Kirby. Mention my name, he'll see her sooner." The surgery bell rang.
"What a pity," said Dr. Adnan.
"I just began to feel we were getting to know one another, and it would have been the best cup of coffee you ever drank. Turkish, of course. Never mind, another time. You can go straight out by this door. I am so pleased to have met you again. Goodbye." "Just a minute," said Lucy. "What did you pay for those pictures, and who?" He grinned, his flashing grin again. It reminded her irresistibly of Mr. Jackson in the tale of Mrs. Titmouse.
"My dear girl, I am the doctor. People are mostly glad to give them to me in acknowledgment of my skill. Lucy walked crossly away, feeling that Dr. Adnan had learned a great deal more about her than she had about him. She telephoned Fawcett, who had had a cancellation at 11 and could see Miss Culpepper then. That gave her an hour. It was no use arriving too early. Mrs. Tilney, hobbling about with her hangover, stumbling, taking her elderly boarders their breakfast in bed, could not abide people coming to her house before 10:30 a.m. Lucy went into an espresso bar and had a cup of coffee, not Turkish, but about 1,000% better than the brew offered to the lodgers in Redcar Street. Someone had left an early edition of the Kirby Evening Advertiser on the seat next to her. She picked it up, wondering if Aunt Fennel would enjoy being taken to the movies. But neither Son of Dracula nor The Secret Life of Sexy Sandra seemed suitable, particularly in view of the fact that Aunt Fennel had probably never set foot in a movie house in her life. A familiar name caught her eye beneath the headline: Widow Battered with Hammer. Mrs. Geraldine Truslove, 44-year-old widow of the Laurels, Tinchwell Street, was admitted to hospital last night with a shock and concussion after being attacked by a man. I had a difference of opinion with a neighbour about the name of his house, she told our staff reporter. It has led to a lot of difficulties. A man has been detained by the police. Oh dear, thought Lucy. Poor silly woman. Maybe if I hadn't tried to stop her, she wouldn't have done it. I hope she's not badly hurt. She read about a performance by the Kirby Thespians of French Without Tears, of how Clow, the Appleby gardener knocked down by a hit-and-run motorist, had made a good recovery, but the person responsible had never come forward, of how the Durham jail escapee was now thought to be in London. A stolen car was found by South London police in a thicket on Putney Heath. On the steering wheel were the fingerprints of Harbin, the escaped man, who was serving a 30-year sentence for his part in smuggling £30,000 worth of stolen gold out of the country. He still had 10 years of his term to go. Harbin was apprehended with another member of the gang when the plane in which they had planned to leave England crashed on a takeoff at Liverpool Airport. Harbin lost a hand in the crash. Gates, the second man, was released last night after serving a full term in his higher sentence. Both men have made several previous attempts to escape. The stolen gold was never recovered. The police have lost track of Gates since his release. Before I was born, Lucy thought. She tried to imagine the emotions of somebody who had escaped from prison after 20 years. One would feel defenseless, at a loss, like an old person who has lost touch with progress, unhappy probably, and antagonistic. One would have paranoid suspicions of everything and everybody. That was why it was not possible to be utterly convinced by Aunt Fennel's fears. She appeared to entertain the same suspicions and terror toward her roommate, who, she said, had stolen her warm winter vests, as toward the unknown hypothetical murderer of her friend Dill. But old people really were defenseless. They had a right to their paranoid fears, whereas if you had come out of prison with £30,000 waiting stowed away for you somewhere, you would presumably feel to some extent buttressed against the unknown. Still, what a different world to come out into. Space flights, kidney grafts, artificial fertilization of human ova, pollution clogging the air and water. It would hardly seem the same place. The country doesn't seem to have changed much, Gates said, looking out across the featureless expanse of moorland, visible from Appleby Old Hall's third-floor bedroom. What did you want to buy a house in this godforsaken place for? Property's cheap round here, Mrs. Marsham said shortly, and it's quiet. By cripes, it is. Well, have you any complaints? No, he said. You've got the place very well fixed up, I don't deny. Yeah, said Gates. It gives me the gooeys to see all those old nuts doddering around downstairs. Rinse, please, said Harold Harbin, who was having his new dental plate adjusted, rinsed and spat. Anyway, Harold went on, Ma has a sentimental attachment to this part, haven't you, Ma? Can't say I share it. I'll be glad to get back to Brum when I've got you fixed up. Sentimental attachment, said Gates. Go on. I should think the only thing Linda would have a sentimental attachment to
would be a humane destroyer. Mrs. Marsham made no reply, but set her lips in a thin line. She was changing the dressing on Harbin's rebuilt nose with swift precision. You didn't come from these parts, though. Harbin spoke with difficulty and cautiously moved his eyebrows up and down. Merseyside born and bred, you were? Old flame of hers came from round here, though, said Harold. Or so she thinks. That's you done, then, he told Harbin. Can't think why you wore your own for so long. They were in a terrible state. Wasn't there a decent dentist in stir? Gates looked uneasy. Harold picked up a container of used dressings and left the room. Old flame, Harbin had been peering at himself sideways in a shaving glass. He glanced round sharply. Who? Gates reflected after a pause. He said, You don't mean Fred. Fred never let on where he came from, said Harbin. Compared to Fred, oysters suffer from frantic verbal diarrhea. Let's switch them to Liverpudlian accents for my best attempt at it. But it was Fred, though, Gates said, studying Mrs. Marsham's inexpressive face. Well, that's a sentimental attachment for you. How did you find out? Said Harbin. A bell rang on the stairs. That's someone at the front door. I must go, Mrs. Marsham said. Oh, come on, Linda, said Gates. Don't be such a clam. After all, we're interested in Freddie too. Don't forget what's-her-name will answer the door. It's only a guess, really, Mrs. Marsham said at last. You were always a pretty smart guesser, Linda, in those gay old days when you were queen of the BICA air hostesses. She was silent again, then she said, There were just 3 little things he let fall at different times. The first time I ever met him, he had a briefcase with the initials WC on it. You'd remember a thing like that, wouldn't you? And I did. Ever after that, he was always Fred Smith. I asked him once about the briefcase, and he said he'd borrowed it from a chap called Cooper, but the name didn't come out quite pat. Harbin nodded. Then another time, we happened to be talking about place names that are spelt out one way and pronounced another, like Cirencester, and he said, Oh, Apley's another, and then stopped short and looked annoyed at himself. Why should he think of such a tiny place, as if he hadn't got connections there? Said Harbin. Pretty thin reasons for moving here, however. What was the third thing? It was once when he'd had a bit to drink. Fred never drank much. He wasn't going to lose control of himself ever, but it was in Hong Kong, and we'd brought off a successful trip, and he was feeling just a little more relaxed than usual. He said, I'm going to be a success in the world, Linda. I don't care what way. I just want my name to be remembered for more than because it's on one of 4 on a village war memorial. There was a silence while they thought about this. Then Harbin said, I take it there are 4 names here? A Holly Road, a Crabtree, and 2 Scarthwaites. Many names in a village beginning with C? Quite a few. Crabtree, Crossley, Coxwold, Clough, Culpeper. There's a couple moved here recently called Carados. Any of them with long-lost relations? Nearly all, she said. Apley's a place most people move away from. Well, Harbin shrugged, it's a fairly remote chance he'd ever come back, don't you think? If he did come from here. Maybe, but Fred was greedy. If anyone died, and there was the question of a legacy, for instance, and as the situation suited in other ways. Oh, sure, I'm not complaining, but this old folks' home is a bloody good idea. Be a little gold mine, I dare say. The internal telephone buzzed. Miss Marsham picked up the receiver. Nora's voice came through. Oh, matron, there's a young lady here inquiring about accommodation for her aunt. Tell her we haven't got any, Mrs. Marsham began irritably. Or, no, I'd better come down, I suppose. Say I'll be down in a moment, but I can't promise anything. What's her name? There was a pause, then Nora returned. She says her aunt used to live in the village here. That's why she's keen to come. You saw the young lady the other day. Her name's Culpeper. And that's the end of chapter 6.